The kitchen was filled with the smell of spices, butter, and roasted vegetables, but behind that aroma was something much heavier: exhaustion. Her hands trembled as she stirred the pot for what felt like the 100th time. Steam rose up, fogging her glasses, making her wipe them again and again with the edge of her apron. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly, reminding her that 24 hours had already slipped away since she first began this marathon of cooking. One dish after another filled the counters. Trays of baked pasta, roasted chicken, salads, desserts carefully decorated with cream. Every corner of the room was overflowing with the evidence of her love. Her back ached, her feet were swollen, but she kept moving, whispering to herself, "It's his birthday. It has to be perfect." The camera of imagination zooms closer, her eyes red from lack of sleep, her knuckles raw from cutting vegetables, her shoulders sagging under the weight of tiredness. And yet, every dish she placed on the table carried something no one could measure: a mother's sacrifice. As the morning light broke, balloons were being tied in the living room. Laughter echoed from the hall as children ran in and out, excited for the big celebration. She heard them, smiled faintly, and wiped the sweat from her forehead. She didn't complain. She didn't stop. She only thought of her son's smile when he would see the feast she had made with her hands. By the time the first guests arrived, she was still putting the finishing touches on the cake. Layers of chocolate, cream carefully spread, candles placed at the top. Her body screamed for rest, but her heart told her, just a little more, just for him. Finally, the kitchen door opened, and she carried the first tray of food into the decorated hall. The children's chatter filled the air, colorful balloons hung from the ceiling, and the table waited to be loaded with dishes. Guests turned to look at her, noticing how tired she was, but also how much she had done. Some nodded in quiet admiration, whispering to each other about how much love it must have taken to prepare all this. And then, her eyes searched for him. Her son. The reason she hadn't slept, the reason her hands were burning, the reason her body felt like collapsing. He stood near the corner, surrounded by his friends, laughing carelessly, not even noticing how heavy the tray in her hands was. She forced a smile, pretending she didn't notice, and placed the food gently on the table. The hook had been set. Hours of sacrifice, days of planning, all for one simple wish: to see her son proud. But she had no idea, in just a moment, the very words she longed to hear would be twisted into something cruel. Because instead of pride, she was about to hear the sentence that would pierce deeper than any knife. The living room looked like something out of a celebration magazine. Colorful balloons floated near the ceiling, some already swaying because of the children running through the space. A long table stretched across the center, covered in a white cloth with blue borders. Wrapped gifts piled up on one side, and the birthday banner, "Happy Birthday, Ryan," hung proudly on the wall. Guests arrived one after another, carrying more presents, their cheerful greetings filling the air. The room buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the sound of party horns. Little feet ran across the polished floor, and every now and then a child's voice shouted, "Where's the cake?" In the midst of this noise, she walked in quietly, carrying a tray larger than her arms could handle. Her shoulders bent under the weight, her back stiff from exhaustion, yet she held her head high. The smell of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread followed her, drawing eyes and whispers from the crowd. Some mothers nudged each other, whispering about how much food she had prepared. Fathers raised their brows, impressed, while others simply smiled politely, but no one truly knew the hours behind those dishes. No one noticed the red lines on her arms where hot pans had grazed her skin, or the faint tremble in her steps as she placed the tray carefully on the table. Her son, Ryan, stood near the window with a group of friends. They were loud, laughing at jokes only teenagers seemed to understand. He didn't look up when she walked in, not even when she nearly stumbled trying to set the tray down. His friends, however, noticed. Some smirked, some whispered, their eyes darting toward the mountain of food being carried in by a single woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. The mother forced a smile as she straightened up, brushing her hands on the apron still tied around her waist. She looked around at the guests, nodding gently in acknowledgement when people complimented her effort. "Everything looks delicious," one woman said softly. "You really outdid yourself," another man added, adjusting his tie. Her heart swelled a little, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned back to the kitchen, where more trays waited. Trip after trip, she carried them out, pasta dishes steaming, bowls of salad fresh with herbs, and baskets of bread warm to the touch. Each time she entered the hall, she hoped her son would notice, hoped he would at least smile, maybe whisper a thanks, Mom. But each time, his eyes stayed on his friends, his laughter louder than the rest. Finally, she brought out the crown jewel, the birthday cake. A tall, layered masterpiece covered in chocolate frosting, with cream flowers on the sides and 20 candles ready to be lit. Gasps escaped the crowd when they saw it. Phones came out, pictures clicked. Children clapped in excitement, tugging at their parents' arms. For a brief second, her heart lit up. She looked at her son, waiting, praying he would finally beam with pride. But Ryan only rolled his eyes at his friends as if the cake was nothing extraordinary. His friends chuckled, shaking their heads, whispering into his ear. The room was full, yet the distance between mother and son felt like miles. She placed the cake gently on the table, her hands lingering on the edge as if holding on to a dream that was slipping away. She looked at the dishes she had spent hours perfecting. She could almost hear the clock from the kitchen ticking in her mind, reminding her of every sleepless hour, every cut, every burn, every drop of sweat. The guests applauded her efforts, praising how grand the party looked. But she only heard silence. Silence from the one person she had done it all for. Her breathing grew heavier, though she hid it behind another faint smile. Inside, her chest tightened, as if preparing for something she didn't yet understand. The setting was perfect for celebration. Laughter, food, decorations, guests, and cheer. Yet beneath it all was an undercurrent of tension. A thin line of unspoken expectation waiting to snap, and snap it did, when the son finally opened his mouth. The candles flickered on the cake, their tiny flames glowing like stars against the dimmed lights of the room. The crowd gathered closer, parents pulling their children to the front so they could see. Phones pointed in every direction, ready to capture the moment. "All right, Ryan, make a wish," someone cheered. Ryan smirked, glancing around at his friends as if the whole thing was more amusing than meaningful. He leaned forward, blew out the candles in one breath, and threw his hands in the air like a victorious athlete. Cheers erupted, clapping filled the air, and yet the one pair of hands that clapped softly, almost shyly, was his mother's. She smiled, her tired face glowing faintly in the candlelight. For her, this was the moment she had worked for. The laughter, the smiles, the celebration. She stood behind the guests, unnoticed, clutching her apron as if it anchored her in place. But then it happened. Ryan's friend, a tall boy with messy hair, nudged him and whispered something. Ryan chuckled, then laughed louder, drawing the attention of everyone around. He glanced at the table overflowing with food, at the trays she had carried one by one, and said in a voice that cut sharper than glass, "Man, look at all this food. If nobody eats it, we'll just feed it to the dogs." The words hung in the air like a cruel echo. At first, a few kids laughed, clapping their hands at the joke. Some adults exchanged awkward glances, pretending not to have heard. But the mother, she heard every word. Her heart stopped for a second. The smile she had been forcing for hours froze on her lips, then disappeared completely. She looked at her son, waiting, hoping it was just a slip, that he would notice her standing there, that he would laugh it off and say, "I'm kidding, Mom." But Ryan didn't stop. He grinned wider, encouraged by his friend's laughter. "Seriously, guys, have you ever seen so much food? My mom went overboard. Like, way overboard. Who even eats this much?" "Dogs, maybe!" The laughter grew louder. His friends slapped him on the back, one of them even imitating a barking sound. The children laughed without understanding, their voices rising above the music. And in the center of it all stood the mother, her hands trembling, her chest rising and falling as if she couldn't catch her breath. She wanted to speak, to say something, to remind him that those hands which smelled of garlic and butter had worked all night for him, that her aching back and sleepless eyes had been for his smile. But her voice caught in her throat. Instead, her mind replayed every step of the last 24 hours, chopping vegetables until her fingers went numb, stirring sauces that splattered onto her skin, kneading dough while her legs screamed for rest. She remembered watching the clock strike midnight, then 3 a.m., then 5 a.m., while she was still standing in the kitchen. She remembered smiling at the thought of him waking up to the perfect party. And now, in front of everyone, her son had reduced it all to a joke about dogs. Some parents whispered softly, shaking their heads. One woman muttered, "That wasn't nice." Another man coughed uncomfortably. But no one confronted him. They all smiled awkwardly, trying to steer the mood back to celebration. The mother stood frozen. Her eyes burned, but she blinked quickly, refusing to let the tears fall in front of strangers. She tightened her grip on her apron until her knuckles turned white. Inside, however, something shifted. A quiet crack. The kind that begins deep in the foundation of a house and slowly spreads until the entire structure collapses. Ryan's laughter rang louder. "Come on, guys, dig in before the dogs do." His friends roared again, piling food onto their plates carelessly, some dropping crumbs on the floor. They stuffed their mouths, joked loudly, spilled drinks, and wiped their greasy hands on napkins that fell to the ground. To them, it was just fun. To her, it was her dignity being trampled under their careless shoes. She finally stepped forward, her movements quiet but sharp, like a shadow slipping into the light. Some guests noticed her and moved aside, their eyes darting nervously between her and Ryan. The music still played. The children still laughed, but in that moment, the air felt heavy, suffocating. She looked at her son. He didn't meet her eyes. He didn't even pause. Instead, he reached for another slice of cake and joked, "If the dogs don't want it, maybe we can sell it to a restaurant." That was the final blow. Her lips pressed together, her jaw trembling with the effort of holding back words that threatened to burst out. Her chest rose and fell, faster now, as if every breath weighed more than the last. But she said nothing. Not yet. She simply turned slowly, quietly, and walked back toward the kitchen. The guests watched in silence, their smiles fading. They knew something had shifted, something irreversible. Ryan, too caught up in his own performance, didn't notice the storm brewing behind his mother's eyes. But he would. Soon, very soon. The kitchen door swung shut behind her with a soft thud, cutting off the sound of laughter and music. Inside, the once warm room now felt cold, as though the life had been drained from it. The aroma of freshly cooked food still lingered, but to her, it no longer smelled like love. It smelled like betrayal. She leaned against the counter, gripping its edge as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her chest rose and fell, her breath shallow, her shoulders shaking. She didn't cry, not yet. Her eyes burned, but her tears refused to fall. She had shed enough of those in her life. Tonight, there would be no more. Her gaze swept across the dishes she had spent hours perfecting. The trays half empty, smeared with sauces by careless hands. The plates stacked high, food wasted, crumbs scattered like insults on the floor. Her heart twisted as she replayed her son's words in her mind. "We'll just feed it to the dogs." Each syllable echoed, digging deeper, heavier than any insult she had endured before. It wasn't just a careless joke. It was a declaration. Her sacrifices had been mocked. Her love dismissed as unnecessary, even laughable. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she saw her younger self, the girl who had once dreamed of a family that would treasure her. She remembered the years of struggle, the nights when she went hungry so her son could eat, the hours she worked to provide him with everything he ever wanted, and now, in front of everyone, he had chosen to shame her. A silence settled in the kitchen, heavy and suffocating, until it was broken by the faint sound of muffled laughter seeping through the walls. They were still celebrating, still eating, still mocking her without even realizing it, but something inside her shifted. Her trembling stopped. Her breathing steadied. Slowly she straightened, releasing the counter and standing tall. The exhaustion in her body didn't disappear, but it was no longer in control. What replaced it was something stronger, resolve. Her eyes, moments ago dim with pain, now hardened like steel. She was done being invisible, done being unappreciated, done being mocked in her own home. A plan began to form in her mind, sharp and deliberate. She didn't need to shout or scream. She didn't need to beg for respect. No, she would show them who she truly was, without raising her voice. Her silence would speak louder than Ryan's laughter. She untied her apron, folding it carefully and placing it on the counter. That simple action felt like shedding a skin, the skin of a mother who tolerated everything. Tonight, she would not be the background character. Tonight, she would not allow herself to be humiliated. In the living room, Ryan's voice rose again, followed by another round of laughter. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the knob. For just a second, doubt whispered in her ear, "Stay here. Ignore it. It's just a joke." But then she remembered the way the guests had looked at her. Pity in some eyes, embarrassment in others. She remembered how her son had avoided her gaze, as though her presence didn't matter. That was when the doubt vanished. She turned the knob slowly, not with the weariness of a tired woman, but with the quiet strength of someone who had made a decision she would not undo. When she stepped back into the hall, her face was calm. Too calm. Her eyes scanned the room, watching Ryan surrounded by his friends, still laughing, still careless. The guests noticed her return, and something in the air shifted. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. The weight of her silence, the storm hidden in her stillness. She didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't need to. Her very presence, the straightness of her back, the steadiness of her steps, demanded attention. A few conversations died mid-sentence. The music suddenly felt too loud. Even the children quieted, as if sensing something unspoken. Ryan glanced up, finally noticing her. He smirked, ready to make another joke, but something in her eyes stopped him. For the first time that evening, his laughter faltered. She walked past the table, past the trays of food, past the guests, and stood near the center of the room. She folded her arms gently in front of her, not in anger, but in control. The silence deepened. Every person in the room waited, unsure of what would happen next. And then, without raising her voice, without a hint of desperation, she spoke, not to her son, not to the guests, but to herself. Enough. It was a single word, quiet, steady, but it carried through the room like thunder. Everyone fell silent. Even Ryan. In that moment, the party was no longer his. The room, the food, the crowd, it all belonged to her. And deep down, everyone knew. The mother who had been mocked was about to reveal a truth no one could ignore. The word enough still hung in the air like a bell tolling in a silent church. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, all of it had died in an instant. Ryan froze, his smirk faltering, his friends glancing nervously between him and his mother. Even the guests, who had pretended not to notice his earlier mockery, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Something about her presence demanded respect, even from those who didn't know her story. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her hands folded in front of her as if she were addressing a court rather than a birthday party. Her calmness unnerved them more than any angry outburst could have. 24 hours, she began quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear and sharp, to every corner of the room. I spent 24 hours in that kitchen. Every dish on this table, every bite of food you're eating, was made with my hands. My body screamed for rest, but I kept going because I thought, just maybe, it would make my son happy. The crowd shifted, some lowering their eyes. Ryan swallowed, his face turning red. But she didn't give him the chance to interrupt. But instead of gratitude, she continued, her voice trembling for a moment before steadying again. Instead of respect, I heard my work reduced to a joke. Food for the dogs. Her words echoed like a blade slicing through the silence. Ryan's friends stared at him, their earlier grins gone. A few parents nodded subtly, their faces reflecting disapproval. She turned to the guests now, her gaze sweeping across them. Do you know what sacrifice looks like? It looks like sleepless nights. It looks like hands burned from hot pans, feet swollen from standing too long, eyes red from exhaustion. It looks like giving everything you have, even when no one notices. Some of the guests murmured, uncomfortable but captivated. Her voice had the weight of truth, and truth was undeniable. And yet, she said, turning her gaze back to Ryan, it takes only one careless laugh, one cruel word, to make all of that invisible. Ryan finally tried to speak, his voice shaky. Mom, don't. Her single word silenced him again. Not harsh, but firm. It wasn't anger that broke him. It was the authority in her tone, the authority of someone who had given more than anyone could imagine and asked for nothing in return. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. You may think this party is yours, that this house, this food, this day belongs to you. But let me remind you of something, Ryan. Every balloon, every decoration, every dish on this table, it exists because I made it so. Without me, there is no celebration. Without me, there is no comfort. Without me, there is no home. The crowd murmured again, louder this time. Some nodded, some whispered to each other. The truth was undeniable. She drew in a deep breath, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. I didn't do all this for applause. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I love you. But love without respect is not love at all. And tonight you showed me something I can never forget. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Guests looked down at their plates, ashamed of the laughter they had joined in. Ryan stood frozen, his face pale, his lips trembling. For the first time that evening, he looked at his mother, truly looked. He saw not just a woman in an apron, not just the tired figure he took for granted, but the strength in her eyes, the dignity in her posture, the unshakable truth of who she was. His friends shifted awkwardly, some stepping back. A boy muttered, "Dude," under his breath, but Ryan couldn't respond. He had no words left. She didn't need to say more. The truth had already been revealed, laid bare in front of everyone. The crowd wasn't laughing anymore. The hall no longer belonged to Ryan's careless jokes. It belonged to her. And though she stood quietly, though she hadn't raised her voice once, she had shaken the very foundation of the room. The climax was here. The mask of disrespect had been ripped away, and now every pair of eyes in that hall judged him for what he had said. The hall was silent, but the silence was louder than any noise could have been. It pressed down on Ryan like a weight he couldn't escape. Every breath he took felt heavy. Every second stretched longer than the last. His mother stood firm, her words still echoing in everyone's minds. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't cursed, yet somehow her quiet truth had shaken the ground beneath him. Then, slowly, the shift began. It started with a single pair of eyes. A guest at the back, a middle-aged woman who had been watching quietly all night, now looked directly at Ryan. Her gaze was sharp, filled not with anger, but with disappointment. The kind of disappointment that stung deeper than rage. Others followed. Parents who had laughed politely at his joke moments earlier now avoided his eyes. They whispered to each other, their voices low but their judgment clear. A man shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." The children sensed it too. They didn't understand all the words, but they understood tone, they understood atmosphere. Their giggles faded into silence, and some clutched their plates, suddenly unsure if eating felt right anymore. Ryan's friends were the most restless. A few shuffled their feet, staring at the floor. One of them, the boy who had barked like a dog, let out a nervous laugh, but it died quickly under the weight of the silence. They had been bold when it was a joke, but now with the truth laid bare, none of them dared defend him. Ryan's smirk was gone. His face was pale, his lips parted as if searching for words that wouldn't come. For the first time, he looked like a boy, not a ringleader. A boy who had been stripped of his armor in front of everyone. The room itself felt like a courtroom. The guests, once passive, now became jurors. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with judgment, with silent verdicts delivered through lowered eyes, folded arms, and pursed lips. One woman finally broke the quiet. She cleared her throat and said softly but firmly, "Your mother deserves better." The words weren't loud, but they spread like ripples across water. Another guest nodded in agreement. Then another. Soon, murmurs rose around the room, each one carrying the same weight: acknowledgement of her sacrifice, condemnation of his cruelty. Ryan's shoulders slumped. His eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for someone to side with him, but there was no ally left. Even his closest friend avoided his gaze, staring down at his shoes. His mother didn't move. She didn't need to. Her stillness was more powerful than anything he could have said. The respect she commanded now wasn't demanded. It was earned, and everyone in the room knew it. Then came the final blow. A man in a crisp shirt, perhaps a colleague of the mother or a family friend, stood up. He looked straight at Ryan and said, "Son, you don't realize how lucky you are. Most people would give anything for a mother who works this hard, who loves this much. And you? You mocked her?" The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was unanimous. Every guest had spoken without speaking. Every face carried the same judgment. Ryan's eyes filled with panic. For the first time, shame clawed at him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his mother, the only person who could save him. But her gaze was steady, unflinching. In that moment, he understood. The crowd wasn't laughing with him anymore. They weren't on his side. They were against him, and worse, they were with her. The balance had shifted completely. The boy who had once commanded attention with careless jokes now stood exposed, stripped of pride. The mother who had been invisible, hidden behind her apron and her labor, now stood taller than anyone else in the room. The judgment was clear. And though no gavel struck, no sentence was read, Ryan had already been condemned. He hung his head, his voice breaking in a whisper only a few heard. "I'm sorry." But it was too late. The room felt heavy, as though every breath carried the weight of judgment. Ryan stood frozen, his head bowed, shame dripping from him like water from a broken vase. His friends shuffled awkwardly, their laughter long gone. Guests sat stiffly in their chairs, unwilling to break the silence that had become louder than any music or chatter, and at the center of it all stood his mother. Still, calm, unmoved. Her eyes scanned the room, seeing every face, every lowered gaze, every look of pity that was now no longer directed at her, but at him. For years she had lived in the background, her sacrifices invisible, her love taken for granted. Tonight, for the first time, the truth was no longer hidden. She drew in a slow breath, then spoke, her voice low but steady, carrying a power that didn't need to shout. "You all came here to celebrate my son." She paused, her eyes shifting briefly toward Ryan. "But what are we truly celebrating if respect is absent? What is a party worth if it is built on humiliation?" The guests stirred, some nodding subtly. She continued, her gaze firm. "I cooked every dish with my hands. I poured my time, my strength, my heart into this day. Not for me, for him. But tonight I've realized something important." Ryan lifted his head slightly, his lips parting as if to speak, but her raised hand silenced him before a word left his mouth. "I realized," she said slowly, her words like iron, "that love without respect is nothing more than slavery. And I am no slave," a murmur ran through the crowd. The sentence cut sharp, ringing true. Some guests glanced at each other, visibly struck. She turned now, looking directly at her son. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't even sad anymore. They were resolute. "Ryan," she said, her tone calm but piercing, "you thought your joke was harmless, but it revealed more than you know. It showed me how little you value the hands that feed you, the heart that raised you, the life that sacrificed everything for your comfort. Tonight, in front of your friends, you turned me into a punchline. But look around you now. Who's laughing?" Ryan's throat tightened. He tried again to speak, but his voice cracked, lost in the silence. "You see," she went on, "humiliation is a strange thing. When you try to put someone else down, it doesn't stay with them. It returns, and it lands on you." The truth struck deep. Ryan's friends stared at the floor. The guests remained quiet, but their silence was no longer uncertain. It was unanimous. They were with her. Then, with deliberate calm, she walked to the table. Dozens of dishes still lay untouched, beautiful yet scarred by careless hands. She picked up one tray, carried it toward the guests, and said softly, "Please, take this with you. Enjoy it at your homes, with your families. Let it not go to waste." Her gesture shocked them, generosity even after insult. Parents stood, helping themselves carefully, some murmuring gratitude. The food, once the subject of mockery, had become a symbol of her dignity. Ryan watched, frozen, as his mother gave away dish after dish. With every plate passed into grateful hands, his humiliation deepened. He understood now. The food he had mocked was no longer his. The party he had claimed as his own was gone. His mother had taken it back, without shouting, without anger, simply by showing who truly held the power. Finally, when most of the trays were distributed, she placed the apron back over her arm and turned to face the room one last time. "Respect," she said, her voice steady, "isn't something you demand. It's something you give, and in return, it's earned. I gave everything I had to this celebration, and tonight I also take something back, my self-respect." The room erupted in soft applause. Not loud, not rowdy, but heartfelt. Guests nodded, some even standing as if in acknowledgement. Ryan's cheeks burned. He wanted to run, to hide, but he couldn't move. His mother's final line still echoed in the hall like a verdict that could not be overturned. She turned to leave, her posture tall, her dignity intact. For the first time, Ryan saw her not just as a mother, but as a woman, strong, proud, and unbreakable. As she reached the door, she stopped, turned slightly, and delivered her final punch. "Remember this night, Ryan, because one day when you truly learn the value of sacrifice, You'll regret the moment you mocked it. And with that, she walked out. The guests followed her with their eyes, some whispering to each other, others shaking their heads at the boy who had lost far more than he realized. Ryan stood alone, surrounded by laughter that had turned into silence, surrounded by friends who no longer admired him, surrounded by the weight of his own mistake. The party was over, but the lesson would last forever.